I want to invite you to open in your Old Testament to Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1. One thing I find interesting about the biblical writers is their honesty. You may have noticed as you've read through the scriptures that they don't really sugarcoat the events that they record. And so the writers revealed precisely what happened. They recorded things precisely as they were. And sometimes that would even mean painting themselves in less than a complimentary way. And so what you find when you read through the Bible is that it didn't matter if someone was a prophet or an apostle or a preacher or whatever. They still struggled at times with obeying God. They didn't always want to carry through with their responsibilities for one reason or another. I'm reminded of a story that I heard years ago, and I think I told it to someone recently. I don't remember the context. But there was a man who was sitting around the around the breakfast table one Sunday morning, and he was reading the newspaper, which probably meant this was like 1957, because I don't think anybody reads the newspaper at the breakfast table. And his wife walked into the kitchen and said, "Honey, you better get ready or we're going to be late." The man said, I'm not going to church today." His wife said, "Give me one good reason why you shouldn't go this morning." He said, "I'll do better than that. I'll give you two reasons." He said, "Number one, I don't like a single person in that congregation. And number two, not a single person in that congregation likes me." And he said, "Now you give me one good reason why I should go." And his wife said, "I'll do better than that. I'll give you two good reasons. Number one, you know that God expects you to be there. And number two, you're the preacher." You know. Well, Jonah was a prophet of God, and he didn't want to do what God told him to do. In fact, he acted more like an anti-prophet than he did a prophet. And so whatever you would expect a prophet to do, Jonah kind of did the opposite, at least at the beginning. And I think he understood what God wanted from him, what God expected from him, but he chose to do what he wanted instead. And what I want us to see this evening is that when he tried to go against the will of God, he ultimately, as the title says, he found himself in over his head. And so let's start reading Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And he went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. And so he paid the fare and went down to it to go with them to Tarshish away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. And then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. And so the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give us or give thought to us that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." And so they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." And then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." And so they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. Now, when you look at the first couple of verses of this chapter, it's kind of pretty standard material in the prophets, which you'd find in some of the other books where the word of the Lord came to a prophet and he gives a commission of some kind. But by the time you get finished reading the third verse, you begin to see that the book of Jonah is not really going to be like other books. In that verse, we get our first hint that we're dealing with a prophet who would rather resign his prophetic office, so to speak, than resign himself to doing God's will. And so when he was commanded to go and preach to the people of the city of Nineveh, Jonah chose to flee from the presence of the Lord, and he went in the opposite direction. He was supposed to go by land to Assyria, and he went by sea to what we would call Spain, or at least he was trying to. And if you'd never heard the story of Jonah, you might come to this point and think, the end. I mean, it's kind of a short book, he gets thrown into the sea and it's all over with. But what I want us to see is that the book of Jonah is not merely about a problematic prophet, it's also about a persistent God. And so the Lord didn't just allow Jonah to disobey, he showed Jonah that he was going to be in control of what took place, no matter what Jonah's will was in the matter. And so what I want us to see this evening is that this book makes some really strong points, I think, about what happens when people try to disobey God. You see several things in this. One, I think you see, is that if when a person is of the mind to do that, when they don't want to obey God, it is remarkable how easy it is to find an alternate course of action, a course other than the one prescribed by God. And you probably noticed that already. And so when you read through the book of Jonah, it's obvious that he had no interest in going to Nineveh. He had no interest in preaching to the enemies of Israel. And instead of obeying the Lord, he goes to Joppa, and sure enough, he finds a boat heading in the opposite direction. Not all that difficult for him to do that. And what I think that says is that whenever a person wants to run away from God's will, we can be sure that the devil will always provide the transportation. He's going to be glad that we're willing to do that. He'll make it possible in whatever way he can for us to be outside of God's will. That's what he wants. He wants to harm us. And we have probably all found that to be true. Whenever we don't want to obey God, there are always ways to get around that. At least we think there are. And so we can always find a way to do that. But second, I want you to notice that disobedience, it kind of has a numbing effect on the conscience. I think it's significant that when Jonah got into the boat at Joppa, he goes down below and he falls asleep. And in fact, it appears to me that he's just kind of sleeping through this storm. And it's as if he didn't even realize that there's something wrong here. And I don't know if that's what's going on. Could be that he's just super tired. I really don't know. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's not. But I do know that sin has that kind of effect on people. It desensitizes us. You probably known someone who could sleep through an alarm clock going off. And you may have wondered to yourself at some point, how does this alarm that, wakes people 3 houses away not wake this person who's 3 feet away? And what usually is the case is, that person has turned off or ignored the alarm so many times it doesn't really have an effect on them anymore. They've learned to sleep right through it. And I think that happens with people spiritually sometimes. The conscience is our spiritual alarm system. And when we disobey God, the conscience is designed to make us feel guilty about it. And yet, if we turn that off enough, we eventually get to the point where we're not really fazed by that any longer. I don't know if that's exactly what was happening here with Jonah. But I do know that we can get to the point where we're comfortable living in rebellion, where we can just lay our heads down and go to sleep. Disobedience has a numbing effect on the conscience. But the third thing is this. Disobedience never escapes God's attention. It just doesn't. Jonah may have fallen asleep below deck, and he may have even believed that his plan of fleeing from the presence of the Lord was going to work, but he was in for a rude awakening, not just from the men who were on the ship with him, but from God as well. And I don't really know that what Jonah was thinking here. Maybe he thought he could just kind of slip out of town and the Lord wouldn't notice what was going on. It didn't work that way. The Lord not only noticed, he wasn't going to ignore it. He wasn't going to just let it go by. And let me just say that we can't expect him to ignore our sin either. It seems to me that people sometimes believe that as long as no one else sees their sin, they've kind of gotten away with it somehow. But again, it doesn't work that way. We may be able to get by with it, so to speak, without other people knowing anything about that. But God knows even when no one else does, and he doesn't ignore it. He doesn't just kind of let it slide, so to speak. And then the final thing along these lines, at least, is that disobedience often puts other people at risk. Someone has said that the waves of rebellion often crash over the decks of the innocent. And I think that's what we see in this chapter. When the storm hit, the men who were on the ship with Jonah, they began looking for answers. I mean, that makes sense. They knew something was wrong. They're described as mariners. They were experienced sailors. And I doubt they would have set out to sea had they been able to tell that there was a storm coming. And more than likely, they had set out under fair weather and were overtaken by what happened. They knew that they weren't dealing with normal circumstances. And so they did two things in response. They began to pray, and they began to do everything in their power to keep the ship afloat. And so in verse 5, we're told that each cried out to his God. And I can't help but wonder if one of the reasons they did that is because they understood by the nature of what was going on that what they were dealing with was not something normal, it was something supernatural in origin. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were as many so-called gods on that ship as there were people, because each nation had its own god or its gods, and they didn't know which deity was responsible for what was happening. And in their minds, all of them had valid deities, but they knew something had been done to anger someone's God. Let me ask you this. Where's Jonah when all of this is going on? He's still below deck. He's still sleeping. Everyone else is up on deck, and they're trying to keep the ship afloat, and the man who is responsible for what is taking place is below deck and putting everybody else in danger. Everyone was praying to their false god in vain, and Jonah, the only one who knows the true God, is silent and asleep. It's interesting to me that when the captain of the ship came to Jonah, he didn't say, "Why are you not up on deck helping us over, throw the cargo overboard? Why are you not doing that?" He said, "Why aren't you petitioning your God on our behalf? Maybe he'll be concerned about us." And Jonah was, going to allow everybody to perish, it would seem. And how many times has something similar to that been played out? How many, for example, children's lives have been ruined because of decisions made by parents, or decisions of which they had no control? Or how many churches have been destroyed because of people who were more interested in working out, their own desires and their own plans than they were about working out their own salvation with fear and trembling? And we could go on and on and on with examples, and we may not like it, but our conduct has an impact on the lives of the people around us. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of impact is my life having on those who are around me? Is it helping? Is it harming? It's obvious that Jonah was putting others in danger because of his chosen course, and truth is we can do the same if we're not careful. But something else I want us to see this evening is that this book makes some clear points about the people of God and the people of the world. And this is really, I'll just go and tell you, I think where this story gets kind of interesting. One of the intriguing characteristics of the book of Jonah is that it's kind of hard to figure out who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. You ever notice that as you're reading through? In most Old Testament books, you can say Israelite, and he's going to be the good guy, pagan of some kind or another, and he's going to be the bad guy. But in the book of Jonah, we find that the bad guys act pretty good. And the good guy doesn't come across as all that good at all the way through the book. And the truth is, the people who are supposed to belong to God don't always act like it. You may have noticed that as well. This principle still holds today. It's really kind of a paradox. In the first chapter of this book, you don't ever read about Jonah praying to God. Not happening. He tries to run away from his God-given responsibility, literally. And it looks like Jonah's religion is pretty much only word deep. And the reason I say that is when they start, digging in and asking him questions. In verse 9, his response is, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." But let me ask, did he really fear the Lord? Is that the conduct of someone who does? God tells you to head, east, and you head west. In Psalm 111, in verse 10, we read that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. That has to go together, doesn't it? Before fear is really, where it operates. And that's not Jonah, not here. He knew the Word of God, but he didn't seem to me that it was really all that, he didn't know the God of the Word, I guess you could say. There's a difference between the two. You can know the Word of God, not the God of the Word. And you find that same principle being dealt with all through Scripture. It's as if God wanted to be sure that he made it absolutely clear that you can't tell who the people of God are merely on the basis of what they say or what they know. That's going to be part of it, don't get me wrong, but it's going to be more than that. All you have to do is look at the people of Jesus' day. The scribes and the Pharisees, they knew a lot of facts about God, and I'm sure they often said the right things. But Jesus would call them in Matthew 23 and verse 37, he would call, or 27 actually, Matthew 23 verse 27, he would call them hypocrites. And he'd say they're like whitewashed tombs. I mean, I've never thought of a whitewashed tomb as being beautiful, but that's kind of the picture that's, looks good, but it's not really. And so that brings us to a question. Am I like Jonah? Am I one of those people who knows all the right phrases, but who doesn't really know God? Am I claiming to belong to God, but not acting like I belong to God? I don't know that there's a more important question that we can ask ourselves than that. But I think there's something else we can point out from this book, and that is that there are many people in this world who don't know the Lord, who just might be interested in knowing him if they were given a chance. You see, I believe the sailors in this chapter play an important part in this book for at least a couple of reasons. First, they provide a contrast with Jonah. They're compassionate. He's not. They seem to be more concerned about what the Lord wanted than he did. But these sailors are also important because they represent the very kinds of people that Jonah doesn't want to go preach to in the city of Nineveh. In fact, I wonder if it's providential that Jonah came into contact with this particular group of sailors. It's almost as if the Lord was trying to say, Jonah, you need to rethink some of your prejudices about things. Maybe these pagan sailors were better than Jonah thought they were. And really, they did seem to be pretty good guys, didn't they? They're willing to risk their own lives in order to help. They don't want to just throw him overboard. They're willing to try to get things back to shore, and they don't want to kill him. That's not what their intent is. And they could have just said to him, you know what? Hey, this is not our problem. You got yourself into this trouble. Not really on us. But they wanted to help him if they could. I think another respectable quality demonstrated by these men is that they were apparently willing to consider new religious truths. I don't know if they stuck with it and continued to grow in their understanding of the Lord, of Yahweh, the God of Israel, but we are told there in verse 16 that the men feared Yahweh exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to Yahweh and made vows. A lot of times when you read the Old Testament and see people in these kinds of situations, it doesn't stick. It's kind of like Nebuchadnezzar. At one point he recognizes God, and at other points he doesn't really do that. And so we don't know how it went with these people. But the story of Jonah isn't really about the salvation of Nineveh. It's about the education of a prophet. It's about how hard it is for God to teach us to look at the people of the world the way that he does, whether it's sailors on the Mediterranean Sea or the people of Nineveh on, I forget if it's the Tigris or the Euphrates, on one of those rivers. We need to look at people the right way. It's a story where the Lord tries to teach his people to stop building walls where he's trying to make inroads. Because that's what he's trying to do. God may have been the God of Israel. That didn't mean he was the God of Israel only. And what we need to understand is that we may be the church of Christ. Christ wants his name to go out into all the world. He wants everybody to hear it. And so as we bring things to a close this evening, I want to quickly suggest a couple of things that we need to remember as we live from day to day. And the first is this. I want us to remember that life is about making choices. It's not about luck. It's not about fate or whatever else. It's about the decisions that we make. And we need to recognize that even one decision that goes against the will of God is something that can have a major impact on the course that our lives take. It can have a major impact on other people's lives. We make the decisions, but we don't get to choose the consequences. And so we need to make wise choices. And then second, I want us to remember, what I want us to remember is to think about God's will for the people that we come into contact with day in and day out as we just go about the affairs of life. Truth is, there are good and honest people out there. They may seem hard to find sometimes. That is the first time I've coughed today, and that's almost miraculous. I'll just go ahead and tell you. They may seem hard to find sometimes, but there are people out there who might just choose to follow the Lord if there was but someone to tell them about him. And I'd add this, I suspect that some of those people are people that we might look at and be tempted to think they're not going to be interested. And we can have the same attitude that Jonah had if we're not careful. And what we need to do is we need to adopt the Lord's perspective as we look at these things. And so I want to encourage you this evening to choose not to be like Jonah. It's kind of weird when you say that. Here's a prophet of God. Do not be like him. If you've been looking at everything the wrong way and making the wrong choices, it's not too late to make the needed changes. Stop running away from God like Jonah did. Instead, turn around and turn back to him and do it in obedience. And if you are here tonight,